All right. Hello, everyone. Those of you congregated in the back, please come up to the front, and we'll sort of try to get tonight or today started. We're going to be going throughout the day. So first of all, the first thing I want to do is welcome you to the Harvard Human Rights Journal Spring Symposium. I'm so glad to have you here. We've been working on this for quite some time, and it's just incredible. Hard to put it in words, seeing it come to fruition. So thank you for being here. Before we get started, there's a few housekeeping things I want to chat about, just so you know about things going on throughout the day. So for example, right now, we're about to have our keynote address, but later in the day, we're going to have a few more events. The first one is going to be at 2 p.m. down in WCC 1015. It's going to be a panel on police violence against ethnic racial minorities related to the Black Lives Matter movement here in the United States, but also dealing with the context in Israel, Palestine, and in Brazil. So that's going to be great. You should definitely come. And if you don't, I will shame you personally. And the second panel after that is at 4 p.m., and that's going to be a panel on material support related to terrorism, but how does it relate to refugee law? And so that's going to be really interesting and really fascinating as well. And again, if you don't come to that, personal shame onto you. It's going to be fantastic. We really would love to have you come. So right now, I want to also thank our co-sponsors. We flew people out to come speak at this symposium from all parts of the United States and sometimes from all parts of the world. So we couldn't do that without our co-sponsors and the people who supported us in doing this. So I want to thank right now the Dean of Students Office, the Human Rights Clinic, the Boston University International Law Journal, which has a little contingent here in the back over there. Thank you. The Black Law Students Association, BALSA, the Muslim Law Students Association, and the Women's Law Association. So these are fantastic groups that have helped us put this together for you. And I also want to thank my co-organizers. We've got Amanda, Leora, and Hannah. And so we've been working on this really hard for all of you. If you just came in from the back, please feel free to grab some food and have a seat. Thank you for coming. And I think that we will start. We will get things started because we only have an hour, and free food can only keep you captivated for so long. So let's get that started. So today, we're going to be having a fascinating conversation that is just going to be incredible because we've got two fantastic people up here on the stage. We've got Professor Lawrence Lessig, who is going to be interviewing our keynote speaker, Jesselyn Radack. Jesselyn is an incredible person. I met her last night, and I got a chance to hear her speak at our Citizen Force screening yesterday. And it was exhilarating to hear her speak. She was recently dubbed quote-unquote badass attorney by Rolling Stone magazine. That's because she worked as a Department of Justice ethics advisor, and upon resigning, she later blew the whistle on an illegal interrogation conducted by the FBI on John Walker Lind, who was the first post-9/11 American citizen detained by the United States. He was captured while in Afghanistan fighting in support of the Taliban, and he was detained and interrogated despite Jesselyn, mentioning explicitly that he should be provided an attorney. Since then, she's, after blowing the whistle herself, she's gone on to develop a career protecting whistleblowers in the intelligence community who have released information on drone operations, mass surveillance, the use of torture. And some of her highest profile clients include Thomas Drake, William Binney, and Edward Snowden. So we're really glad to have her here today. And we're really thankful that you're here to come listen to her. So everybody please give a round of applause for Jesselyn Radack.
So Jesselyn, welcome to Harvard.
Thank you.
And let me start by saying, as a citizen and as a lawyer who believes our highest calling is to support our work as citizens, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for what you did. To many, your work has been an inspiration. And I want to make sure in the course of the half an hour that we have to talk before we take some questions, that the difficulty of the choices that you were forced to make is made clear, because the story of heroes is often told as if heroicism is somehow easy. And obviously, what you've gone through has not been easy. So let's start by making sure we're all on the same page, understanding a bit of what brought you to this moment of decision where you could choose to do what I think we believe was the right thing, or to choose to do what maybe too many in the government chose to do. So could you just help us to understand the lead up to the questions around John Walker Lindh?
Sure. For me, I was the ethics attorney at the Department of Justice. And our duty was to render advice prospectively before the civil or criminal division wanted to do something that was ethically problematic. I was called one day and told that the FBI had captured an American fighting with the Taliban. And I was told unambiguously that he had counsel. I advised that John Walker Lindh, who was dubbed the American Taliban by the media, needed to be afforded his counsel before being interrogated. Moreover, there was a trophy photo that was circulating around the world of John Walker Lindh, naked, blindfolded, gagged, bound, with epithets written on him. It looked very reminiscent of what we later saw at Abu Ghraib. So I also had advised that we absolutely should not be engaging in torture. That part often gets left out of the story. And part of that is my fault, because I'm still under a gag restriction with regard to that. But anyway, after they interrogated him anyway, they called back and said, oops, we interrogated him. And I advised that the interview should be sealed and used only for national security or intelligence gathering purposes, but not for criminal prosecution. Meanwhile, the government decided, again, to disregard that advice and use it to prosecute him. And the crux of the criminal case was his confession during the problematic interrogation. So I received an email from the prosecutor saying, as you know, there is a court discovery order for all Justice Department correspondence related to John Walker Lindh's interrogation. I have 2 of your emails, and I wanted to make sure I have everything. And this immediately struck me as strange, because I knew I'd written way more than 2 emails. And back then, we kept hard copy paper files of everything. And I knew the file was like an inch thick. I confronted my boss, and she said, I sent everything in the file. I was one of those naive 29-year-olds, like Edward Snowden, and I went and checked the file, and sure enough, there were only 2 pieces of paper in the file. So I resurrected the missing emails from my computer. I wrote a memo to my boss, and I made a copy of the emails to take home in case they disappeared again, and I resigned. As the pretrial continued to progress, it became abundantly clear that the Justice Department had still not turned over my emails. Over and over again, the department asserted that he never had counsel. I knew that he was facing 3 death penalty counts at that time, and couldn't live with myself knowing that someone could be put to death because I kept my mouth shut. So I tried to go to the judge with the emails, but I no longer had standing because I was not at the Justice Department any longer. So I ended up giving my emails, which were unclassified. I ended up giving them to Newsweek. They did a huge article, and the Lindh case ended in a surprise plea bargain deal the next day. But the consequence of that, I could have never imagined. It was like I had unleashed the full force of the entire executive branch. I was placed under one of the first federal criminal leak investigations, so there's really no such crime called leaking. I was referred to the bar associations in which I'm licensed as an attorney, and I was placed on the no-fly list. It made for a miserable number of years in my life, but also solidified my commitment that if I could ever get back on track, that I would dedicate my life to representing whistleblowers.
So let's go back to the naive 29-year-old, which is a position that many in the audience will appreciate. So as this was unfolding, were you surprised that this was happening? Had you seen anything like this before? Did you expect that maybe there had been a mistake, and once you revealed the mistake, they would correct it? Did you have faith that the system would work?
I did. I had not seen anything like this happen personally. At the same time, the Justice Department was prosecuting Enron and Arthur Anderson for destruction of evidence and obstruction of justice. So the idea that the same thing would happen to my emails was really inconceivable to me. And at first I did think that this had been some bureaucratic blunder. But then, when I found out that there were the two innocuous pieces of paper in the file. One said thank you, and the other said we're closing out the file, and a cover sheet from my boss to the prosecutor. I realized that this had gone much higher up. And through the work of amazing investigative journalists over the years, Charlie Savage and Jane Mayer and Eric Lischblau have been able to uncover a lot more of the backstory about how high this went up in the department.
So who ordered the emails destroyed?
That's unclear to me. I think my boss at the time, Claudia Flynn, decided on her own to get rid of the emails because they conflicted with the public position that the department had decided to take, which was that it had every right to interrogate John Walker Lindh. Though I know in terms of the investigation of me afterward, Michael Chertoff, who now runs the Chertoff Group, he had been the director of Homeland Security and a federal judge. He manufactures those body scanners at the airports and is glad to fearmonger. He was leading a lot of the charge against me in the aftermath.
OK, so when the consequences of your revealing this information to the New York Times started to appear, like being put on the no-fly list, and all of those were consequences that you did not expect were going to happen. As they were happening, did you try to reach out to others to help and get others to stand with you and defend you that did or didn't actually defend you?
Yes. At the time, there was no whistleblower network that I was aware of. I think there's a much stronger whistleblower networks, in part because of the internet has allowed people to find each other. I had my criminal defense attorney, I had an employment attorney, and I had Bruce Fine, a constitutional attorney, representing me. So it was very surreal as an attorney to suddenly be represented by a battery of attorneys. But I really didn't feel like I had anybody that I could reach out to, though later on, as the case collapsed against me and the charges were dropped and things like that, the DC Bar case closed 2 years ago, after more than a decade. And at that point, I did reach out to a number of legal ethicists and law professors, civil liberties icons, and they all wrote a joint letter about how politicized the bar discipline by DC was.
Because DC was different, right? You were a member of the Maryland Bar,
yes,
as well as the DC Bar. And the Maryland Bar pretty quickly came around to say there was no basis for the ethics charges that the Justice Department had laid against you. But the DC Bar didn't do that for a decade. Because
the DC Bar, in my opinion, oddly, during this whole thing, I was elected to serve on the DC Bar Legal Ethics Committee. So this is a very dysfunctional bar, but it's a very politicized one, populated by a lot of pro-government people. And even though normally under reciprocity rules, if your primary licensure bar, Maryland, makes a decision, DC will do the exact same thing. And here that didn't happen. And the DC was happy to, the DC Bar, let itself be an arm or a tool of the government to retaliate, because believe me, no one wants to hire you if you are under a bar investigation, because even if you haven't been found of wrongdoing yet, it's this sort of Damocles hanging over your head, and why would you hire someone who could be disbarred? Now, right now, the exact same thing is happening to a guy named Thomas Tam, who revealed warrantless wiretapping in the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times articles by Jim Risen and Eric Lischblau. His revelation was in 2004, and just now, they have filed bar charges against him after the criminal investigation closed and after the Maryland bar, where he's also licensed, dismissed the charges.
So there's a decision that you had to make in deciding to turn this information over to Newsweek. And in that decision, you're obviously weighing both the consequences to you and the necessity to the public and the appropriateness of crossing that line. And I know when I interviewed Edward Snowden remotely, he was incredibly articulate about the specific reasons why it was appropriate for him to take the steps that he took. And those reasons related to the failure of ordinary systems of checks to reveal the information that he was going to reveal. So when you were thinking about going to Newsweek, describe that decision. What was pulling you in both directions on that decision?
Well, it was motivated by months of insomnia. Actually, I think that was the first good night's sleep I got, was the night after I gave the emails to the media. But for me, it didn't feel like much of a choice. I mean, I had complained internally. I complained to my boss. I tried to complain to the judge. I had tried these other mechanisms to redress it the way you were supposed to. By that point, I had also filed my own whistleblower complaint with the Inspector General at the Department of Justice. Again, that was used instead to open an investigation onto me, rather to investigate what I had complained about had occurred in the Lynn case. So I felt like at that point, I needed to go outside the traditional system. And contrary to what the government would have you believe, going to the press is still a viable way to blow the whistle. The government will scream and shout that that's not true, but it's part of the First Amendment. And it is an important check on the government, and I believe that whistleblowers and journalists are the fourth estate and this other check, the safety valve when other mechanisms fail.
But so one mechanism was to go to Newsweek. And what's distinctive about Newsweek is it's a traditional journalist organization. You didn't post this on the internet. You went to journalists. Was there an alternative, which was just to turn the documents over to the lawyers representing Lynn?
That was definitely an option, but I thought that it would look more partisan and that my motivations would be questioned if I went directly to the defense attorneys and turned the documents over. And I thought a public airing of the documents would be more appropriate, because that way both sides would see them and the judge and be able to act accordingly. And at that point, we barely had the internet at the Justice Department. So the idea of going to WikiLeaks or uploading them onto some sort of digital platform was just not even on the menu of options at that point.
OK, so when you now obviously are representing whistleblowers, Edward Snowden is someone you're working with. As a whistleblower comes to you, or a potential whistleblower comes to you, how do you help her or him think through this process? Like, what are the, as a lawyer, not an advocate for whistleblowing, but as a lawyer interested in the interest of the client, what are the choices? What do they have to be confident of if they're willing to do what you did and what others have done?
Well, unfortunately, probably 90% of the people who walk through my door have already blown the whistle, as is the case with Snowden. And suddenly, they're being retaliated against by the government with a vengeance. So my role there is different at that point. But when people do come to me ahead of time and want to blow the whistle, the first thing I try to do is look and see whether there are viable internal channels. But unfortunately, for national security and intelligence whistleblowers, they are not. They are specifically exempted from the Whistleblower Protection Act. They have very few avenues of redress internally that work. And so we have to talk about the fact, I mean, Tom Drake, is the best case, kind of case study that I have available to them. I mean, here's someone who went through every conceivable internal channel, which is what the government says over and over and over again Snowden should have done. He went to his boss. He went to the NSA General Counsel. He went to the Department of Defense Inspector General. He went to the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And not only did they fail to redress the problem, but they ended up turning around and referring him for prosecution, and prosecution under the Espionage Act. So the stakes are extremely, extremely high. And the darker the secret with the US government, the greater the blowback is going to be. And that's something people have to calculate. And I have clients in jail, and I have clients who've served time in jail because they made calculations. I think everyone kind of underestimates the ferocity of the government's response. But with other whistleblowers, if they haven't blown the whistle yet, we try to help them do so in the safest means effectively. And for intel and national security, that's usually working with journalists.
Yeah, so in the context of that decision, it must be that these people strike you as having a certain character, a certain strength. What's striking about the data about whistleblowers in general is that we know them to be people who, in a particular culture, are outsiders. So the Enron whistleblowers are the women in in that context, because very male culture. They're not included as tightly in that culture. And so in some sense, it's easier, or they don't feel the burden of peer pressure as heavily as others do inside the culture. Does this teach us something about how, if we want to assure internal checks on a system, we should be concerned about the diversity of people inside of the system? Or is there something that you've seen because of the number of cases that you've now looked at about how we could encourage more or better internal checks because of this type of whistleblower protection?
Yeah, I think definitely, I mean, to the extent that you're an outsider, and for a while there, with the Time Magazine's Persons of the Year in 2003 were 3 women who had blown the whistle in predominantly male institutions. So I think the outsider phenomenon is part of it. But my whistleblowers who blew the whistle before Snowden, Tom Drake, Bill Binney, Ed Loomis, and Kirk Wiebe, had worked at the agency for about 30 years each, and before then had military backgrounds. So they were classic G-men in so many different kinds of ways. Yet I think the outsider theory is probably more applicable to the fact that I guess people who want to follow the law are now considered the outsiders in government. But I think the outsider theory is part of it. But part of these people, I think most people have an impulse to correct something if it's wrong. A lot of people say, I don't think I could ever have done what you did or blown the whistle. And I always say, if you saw a little old lady being mugged, would you dial 911? And usually every hand goes up, yes. That's a form of whistleblowing. I think it's, the context and decisions and the things you'll come across as lawyers are going to be different in their facts. But everyone has a different internal squeal point of something that is so wrong they can't countenance it any longer and still remain an integrated person.
But your examples of the pre-Snowden whistleblowers is really interesting because it suggests, kind of hopefully, that what we're seeing now is a significant deviation from what existed before. I mean, these are people who are blowing the whistle on an institution they think is misbehaving, and if they've been there 30 years, it must be misbehaving relative to what it was before. Is it your perception that, I guess both in Bush and Obama, we have a government that is, you joked about this a bit, but say it explicitly if this is what you believe, moving away from this internal constraint of the law more openly or more aggressively? And what explains why that would happen now?
Absolutely. I mean, my biggest explanation for it is 9/11. I feel like at the Department of Justice, I mean, there was a night and day change. And I mean, even Rumsfeld said the gloves come off after 9/11. And there was this fundamental shift. And even, I mean, if you read General Michael Hayden's book that just came out, Playing to the Edge, he's talking about the edge of the law. And he not only played to the edge, he played way beyond the edge. And that after 9/11, under Bush and also under Obama, the national security state, the executive branch increased and expanded its power exponentially. Congress became even more compliant and complicit than it already is. And the judicial branch ended up being effectively shut down because the government would assert state secrets privilege or standing anytime anyone tried to challenge torture or surveillance or any of the other more problematic government conduct that was emerging after 9/11.
But it's always struck me like, you go out and you have a crazy night, and the next morning you wake up and you think, oh my God, what did I do? I've got to make up for it. And you kind of wish that would happen with the United States. Like 9/11 triggered all sorts of insanity, across the board. Insanity in the military, insanity in justice, insanity in surveillance. And it's understandable. I mean, it's not crazy why it happened. I mean, these were good people motivated by what they thought were real threats. So you don't have to question the integrity of what got it going. But is there a place or a time or an opportunity where we as a nation can kind of wake up and say, well, that was just crazy, and we've got to come back to real principles we can defend again? I mean, do you sense that inside the Justice Department?
I don't sense that is happening. I was hoping that, of course, I mean, it's normal after any kind of national security emergency or problem like that, you're going to have kind of this vast swing. And after 9/11, that happened. And I thought eventually the pendulum would swing back to some point of equipoise. But instead, it just kept swinging further and further and further to the right. And there are a couple moments I thought we might have a course correction, like after the Abu Ghraib scandal. I felt like that was sort of a beginning of a changing point in the torture debate. I felt like after Edward Snowden's revelations, finally, this was a changing point in terms of the conversation about surveillance and surveillance reform. And it's taking a long time, but it's happening. You can see that most recently with the Apple versus FBI case that really involved, and most people knew a lot more about that and got a lot more involved. But I don't feel like I don't feel like at this point our society would ever have another church committee come out of Congress. And I really do think—
the church committee that reviewed the CIA.
Yes, and the COINTEL program and a lot of the programs used by Nixon to spy on anti-war protesters and civil rights leaders and that kind of thing. I mean, we're doing the same thing now. The government is spending its time surveilling human rights lawyers, Muslims, people, hundreds of millions of people who have absolutely no connection to any crime whatsoever. And so I keep hoping there will be a movement that will bring us back, and it has not happened. And I worry about our democracy. I feel like we are a democracy in decline, and like the fall of many great empires, we are going down the garden path towards, I mean, we've moved so far away from being a free and open democratic society.
It is interesting to think who could lead us back. And I do think that the Apple case is important and interesting because, of course, right after 9/11, all those tech companies were cooperating. I mean, they all were complicit in enabling the surveillance state to take off. But now you're beginning to see strong pushback after the Snowden revelations, I think, in particular, where tech companies are explicitly anxious about being seen as tools of the surveillance state. And so Apple's stand is one example, but you must be working or connected to other tech companies. And do you have a sense that they have a plan, or they have a strategy, or at least the idea that maybe they are the force in this society that could get us back to these values?
I think I don't know if the tech giants so much see themselves as a force of change, but as Edward Snowden has made clear, if Congress won't fix it, tech will. And he's talking about encryption and other means of protecting internet communications and keeping an open and free internet. These tech companies, yes, were fully cooperating with the government, but I don't think they even knew that the government, the degree to which the government was still backdooring them. It wasn't enough that they were just cooperating. The government was taking more and more and more. And then when people found out after Snowden, there was a lot of outrage among customers, and tech companies started issuing transparency reports, and they started bolstering encryption and privacy settings and things like that. And they're not perfect, but I think they realize, yes, that this is who are they serving here? The government or the people? I mean, in a democracy, the people are supposed to control the government, not the other way around.
Yeah, and what's striking about the current Apple fight is that Apple seemed to be rallying a whole bunch of technologists to the idea that there needs to be a limit on what the government can do. And now there's a whole bunch of technologists who are racing to the government and saying, look, we can decrypt the Apple phone or give you access to the Apple phone without the cooperation of Apple. So there doesn't seem to be a common view, at least among the technologists. There's just an opportunity here for technology to be used for good, what Apple's trying to do, maybe, and not for good in the way that people are breaking this apart.
And I think that's going to be true with technology in general, but I feel like on the balance, there were far more technologists and cryptographers and people on the side of Apple and knew what a bad, far-reaching precedent that the FBI was seeking, that it was not just about unlocking one phone that wasn't even used for personal communications, realized historically what a dangerous precedent this would be. And while, yes, there are some hotshots out there who are like, we can help you decrypt it anyway. And Johns Hopkins, was a neutral academic institution, was able to find another vulnerability in the iPhone. Yes, while that happens, I feel like the majority of people, that was the first time I felt like a massive pushback in terms of galvanizing tech to really draw a very strong line in the sand.
So give us a picture of what the process is right now inside of the Justice Department for deciding who and how to surveil Americans, putting aside the foreign surveillance. I mean, do we know what's going on right now?
You know what you are told by government and journalists who act as stenographers and basically jot down government talking points on this. But really, what's going on is happening more within the NSA, who doesn't feel like it needs to be accountable to the Justice Department and sees itself as separate. The NSA, I think there was a lot of fanfare about the USA Freedom Act and how this was going to end mass phone collection, and with the Second Circuit court case, after a certain point, that would end it. But people don't realize, again, because the media, and I hold the media to account at some point on this, the media was like, bulk surveillance ends. No, a teeny tiny fraction of bulk surveillance ended, but there's still the same old surveillance going on under an executive order 12333. So there's still surveillance going on. I haven't done so myself, but one of the things I have on my on my to-do list is to write a bill about what to do with all the data that's already been collected and stored by the NSA, about proper destruction of that data. But as far as I know, there's no attorney-client privilege carve-out that NSA has. There's no doctor-patient carve-out. They're still collecting, and they're still building a Utah data storage facility that will be able to store 100 years worth of data on all 320 million people in the United States.
So were you surprised? Was Snowden surprised after these revelations were made so plain that there hasn't been more of a public reaction against this story?
You know, I don't know if it's been a surprise. I mean, institutions are slow to act. I mean, I think there was a major public reaction against the story, mainly negative in the United States, when 60% of the people thought Snowden was a traitor and 40% thought he was a hero, and now those numbers have been inverted over the years. It takes a long time to get meaningful reform, and other countries have been able to do so more quickly. And they're not only surveillance reform, but there's also been surveillance atrocities and bad reform, the surveillance expansion, like in the UK. In terms of reform, though, it's not just surveillance reforms we've seen. I mean, it was amazing that to hear human rights groups call whistleblowing a human right. I never thought that would happen in my lifetime. It's amazing to hear the UN say that privacy is a human right, and to say that with respect to surveillance. So I think there are a number of other reforms in other contexts we need to look at more broadly. There have been tons of reforms if you've been trying to use encryption. How many people here encrypt? Okay. Wow. Now, and most journalists do not. 75% of journalists do not use encryption. This is after Snowden, when we know that the government has been surveilling journalists. And as attorneys, it's incredibly important, especially human rights attorneys. I mean, the government has a history of going after and tracking human rights groups. Why? They don't pose any threat of terrorism, but I mean, it goes to show what the government finds threatening and who it wants to drill down on. So in the tech world, encryption has improved at a rocket pace. I mean, it still has a long way to go, but it's a lot easier to use today than it was in 2013. So there, things are moving very fast, and in the law, things are slower. But they're happening, and they're happening faster in Europe than they are here. But I feel like it's just been a race to the bottom in the United States in terms of so many different issues regarding First Amendment, free speech, human rights, surveillance. So,
and in the context of your litigation around whistleblowing, obviously the different jurisdictions have different protections. Even inside the United States government, there's different kinds of protections. What's the best example of whistleblower protection? Because there's plenty of bad examples of how the law fails. But is there one that you would point to as a great example of how this could work?
Yeah, I think, first of all, in the environmental context, there are 7 different statutes that protect environmental whistleblowers that have been fairly successful. The Key TAM Act, which allows people, usually defense contractors, to bring suit as whistleblowers, has had success, but largely in the Medicaid and Medicare fraud context. If you're a corporate whistleblower, you have far more protection than a national security or intelligence whistleblower. You have the Dodd-Frank Act and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and other people who at least have a constituency outside, that do care about hearing from you. But if you're a national security or intelligence whistleblower, there's no lobby for you. There's no one out there saying, I mean, even though you think these are the revelations we would most want to know about: torture, surveillance, war crimes. These are the deepest, darkest secrets of my generation, and we know about them because of whistleblowers and the brave journalists who've been willing to write about those stories. So I mean, whistleblowing does work, but for all his complaints about the leaks and the leak problem, the way to remedy leaks is easy. You need to have meaningful, effective whistleblower protection reform.
Yeah. Okay. So we have about 17 minutes for questions. There's a mic roaming someplace. Let's send the mic right here to the center first.
Thank you. I just wanted to add my voice of thank you and deep respect. I mean, it's just sheer admiration. Last week, Chelsea Manning had an op-ed in The Guardian, and I was horrified to read it about something called the National, there's some task force, insider task force that they've made. And he was identifying some personality traits that are based on him that they've now said, other people in government have to watch out for. But they include things like people who have an ego, an ideology, personal family issues. Like, who doesn't? This is really crazy to me, so it's very scary. And just linked with that, 2 nights ago, I was watching something called Hearts and Minds, which I had never seen before. It's a documentary from 1974. It's about Vietnam. I recommend everyone watch it. But I was watching Daniel Ellsberg speak in that because he's interviewed in that. And it's so unbelievable what I see as a personal sacrifice that Snowden has made. This is a young man, and now what? The personal sacrifice seems too great and too grave. So if you put together this task force that they've made, and how does it all how does it all come together?
I think in terms of, I speak with Chelsea regularly, and she wrote that article about the Insider Threat Program after 2 of my clients, Edward Snowden and Thomas Drake, were put on a slide, put out by the Director of National Intelligence Office, a slide of people who would do us harm. And it had pictures of convicted spies, real spies. It had pictures of the Navy Yard shooter. It had a picture of another mass shooter, and then it had Thomas Drake and Edward Snowden sandwiched in there. And this prompted Chelsea to go ahead and try to get her records. And amazingly, part of what they sent her when she FOIA'd her own records under Freedom of Information Act were further teaching materials based on her sexual identity issues and her feelings of alienation and her family problems. And it is such a corrosive, dangerous place for a country to be in when the government is encouraging people to spy on and report their friends and colleagues and family. That's East Germany. That's the Stasi. And it's terrifying, and again, also useless, because as you point out, the character traits of those who would do us harm are things like personal and family problems, spends too much time on the computer. That would be my teenagers. It's just so overbroad, and it's so insidious that we've reached that point, and that whistleblowers are being used as a case study of the people who would do us harm when they're the people who've revealed stuff that is incontrovertibly in the public interest. If they were a bunch of cracks who had nothing important to say, the media wouldn't be covering it. That's my comment on and how to not get discouraged. You know what? People make brave decisions every day, and I don't think they're thinking, what could happen to me if this happens? Edward Snowden has said very publicly he watched what happened to Thomas Drake and what happened to Bill Binney, who I represent, and that he made his decision accordingly after watching them go through internal channels and get burned.
More questions? Is there a question up here?
Hi. I'm also a human rights attorney, and I represent an organization called Breaking the Silence in Israel, which is a group that gathers testimonies from mostly anonymous IDF soldiers about their service in the occupied territories. And one thing that has been happening recently, the organization has been active for over 11 years, and suddenly it's under a lot of attack. And the organization has always we've sort of built this legal theory around the organization that it should enjoy reporter privilege, that should be seen as similar to a journalistic organization. And now it's being asked to break that privilege and turn over sources. And I know that there are a lot of whistleblowers that are still underground, and I wondered if in the United States there's also pressure on journalists specifically to reveal their identity, and how reporter privilege sort of plays into all of this.
Absolutely. I know everyone probably by and large loves Barack Obama, but he has led a draconian war on whistleblowers, prosecuting more of them under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined. And this war on whistleblowers has been a backdoor war on journalists, because in every single indictment, it names multiple journalists. And in a case that was litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court, Jim Risen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist for the New York Times, was being asked to testify against his source, Jeffrey Sterling, in yet another whistleblower prosecution. And they found against him that there was no reporter source privilege on the federal level. There are a bunch on the state levels. But yes, this is a huge problem right now in terms of the government going after sources. And they're relying on tech to do that. And again, there are means of countering this. This is where technology takes the lead and creates programs like Secure Drop that journalistic organizations can use so people can submit documents safely. But yeah, the crackdown on organizations like yours, unfortunately, is occurring here, too.
It's right over here.
So, Jesselyn, according with your last answer, how do you read Mr. Obama's speech on Havana, Cuba, 2 days ago, promoting and asking Cuban civic groups to adopt Internet and push transparency and push integrity and acts integrity to the Cuban government? How this double speech works inside the United States and outside the United States?
It's hypocritical. I mean, it's hypocrisy. I mean, we're the most open and transparent administration in history that has the worst overclassification under Obama, the most number of cases shut down by the state secrets privilege, the worst surveillance ever. You know, and it's not me, lefty liberal up here, saying that he has been the worst president since Nixon for First Amendment and press freedom. That is the New York Times saying that. And so I find it very hypocritical when the president lectures Cuba, whose island we've been using for the past 11 years as a concentration camp, when he lectures Cuba about human rights.
Hi, so I just want to thank you again for being here today. And my question is, just given that we know of this like post 9/11 perception by the government that greater checks is kind of necessarily in conflict with human rights, what do you think is the way of changing that perception? Because it seems very clear to me that, first of all, it's not empirically proven to be true that greater checks will lead to compromised national security. And second of all, that greater checks, like you said, will lead to the kind of information that we most want to reveal in order to reform those things and not kind of fuel the fire in terms of anti-American sentiment. So like, what does it take? Does it take like presidential leadership? Is it a push to, commitment to DOJ reform? I know you said a greater whistleblower protections is a big part of that. Is it also like a coalition of companies like Apple or other entities with power that are kind of taking a stand against these policies? But the greater question is just, what will it take to kind of change this perception that greater checks and coming out with this information is necessarily in conflict with national security interests? I
mean, I think overall it takes a citizen revolution, and it's about time we have American Revolution 2.0. I'm not saying we need to have guns and that kind of stuff, but really an uprising among the populace. And I've seen glimmers of that and glimpses of that, but part of it is this false narrative that the government has been selling for the last 15 years about liberty versus security, and you can't have both. And I absolutely reject that. It's a false dichotomy. You can definitely, I mean, in fact, you need liberty to have better security. But after every single terrorist attack that occurs, whether it's the Boston bombings or the Paris attacks, San Bernardino, whatever, you always hear that we need to curtail your liberty more. We, for your own good, we need to be able to break encryption. We need to be able to go around house to house like they did after the Boston bombings. I mean, hello, that's why we have a Fourth Amendment, to prevent general searches of the British under general warrants. Militaristic-looking law enforcement responses to regular protests in the Black Lives Matter movement, that kind of thing. I mean, this is a problem at the top, and is perpetuated by the people at the top. And the people at the top are the same people at the top. I mean, Michael Hayden's been kicking around the upper echelons of government for the last 25 years. It's people, it's a revolving door, but a lot of the same people are the same people under with a Democratic or Republican administration. It's not a partisan problem, but it's about blowing apart this narrative that we've created after 9/11, that you cannot have both liberty and security. And for all the surveillance that we have in this country, it has absolutely, utterly failed to detect or prevent the Boston bombing, the Paris attacks, the Belgian bombing, even though in all three of those cases, the host nation had been tipped off to keep an eye on the Tsarnaev brothers or on particular suspects. But because of our over-reliance on the surveillance apparatus, the human intelligence has become lazy.
I mean, one of the hopeful dynamics in this is how people on the inside begin to recognize the mistake in this strategy. My colleague Ron Suskind, in his book, The Way of the World, describes a senior CIA person who's in charge of sussing out the truth about sale of nuclear material that might be used to create a dirty bomb. And he goes through this evolution, and at the end of his career, comes to the position that they ought to get rid of all these secrets completely, ought to open it all up, because the only way to get the information that the government needs is if they create an environment where people can trade and understand the information, because that would bring more information to the government than this obsession with secrecy. And if you begin to imagine the government realizing these techniques are self-defeating for the objectives of the government, then you might begin to break apart this kind of single-minded thinking inside of the government right now.
And supposedly after 9/11, that was one of the lessons learned. We need to share information. But right now, we're talking about sharing information in terms of the NSA sharing all of the ill-gotten collected information it has with local law enforcement, completely eroding any wall whatsoever between domestic law enforcement and foreign intelligence gathering. But I mean, I agree. I mean, I think people in government, some of them are having epiphanies that this is not working and that we're on the wrong path. And again, I see glimmers of hope here and there. But I think we have the unbelievable surrealistic presidential landscape we have right now because of just complete populist. It's like at a crazy tipping point. I mean, it literally is insanity to me what's going on. And I hope that, I agree. Information, I think Aaron Schwartz is right and Chelsea Manning is right. Information wants to be free. And the more you bottle it up and try to contain it, the more it's going to try to come out. And whistleblowers are one of those safety valves. When you've been bottling up information, they're one of the many safety valves in a democracy for that information to get out. And fewer of those safety valves are available.
So you have, is it 2 boys that you have?
I have 2 boys and a girl.
Okay, and they were very young during all of this. So I think when this all started, the oldest was 4 or something like that. So how did you explain to your kids what was happening to you?
It was very hard at their age to understand why I was suddenly
in trouble.
and at home, and why there was a whisper campaign going on in my synagogue. I mean, DC is a small place, and you can't go to the grocery store, you can't spit without hitting a politician or someone in government. And so it was very hard. I think as I got older, I mean, even at a young age, one of my sons said to me, I think I know why they're mad. And I said, oh, okay, why are they mad at me? And he said, you were a tattletale, and they've given you a very long time out. And I was like, okay, in his own, 7-year-old mind, he gets it. He gets it on some level. And now that they're teenagers, they have a more sophisticated understanding of this. And I think as high schoolers, they have, and growing up in a tech era where, they get mad when I hack into their phone, and I know it's hypocritical of me. But really, they don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in our household until they're 18. So, they'll call me out for things like that. But I think they understand the value. They still put way too much personal information out there, but they also know how to use encryption. They also, like too many teenagers, falsely believe that things are safer than they are, like Snapchat. Those things actually stay around. They don't just disappear. And that I can access their secret Instagram account as well as their regular Instagram account. And that it's pretty easy to break their passwords. I think they're growing up with a more sophisticated understanding of the role of technology, but also the role of government, and the role of the man. And in their mind, sometimes I'm the man. Me and my husband are the man. But I think they're more cognizant of this in a way that I certainly wasn't in high school.
So Jesselyn, as a citizen, as a lawyer, thank you.
Thank you.